Welcome, everybody, to another special episode of the Into the Impossible podcast featuring today's guest, Ben Shapiro. Now, before you hit unsubscribe, unfollow, and send me a poisonous pen message, please note that this conversation, like all my conversations with Noam Chomsky and Larry Tribe and Eric Topol, as well as with Ben and his cohorts at the Daily Wire and elsewhere, is non-political. I don't get into politics. I don't think politics is particularly interesting. I've never had a desire to be a politician or to target them. I think they do a great job. I've hosted the mayor of San Diego, and I've hosted other people, but as always to look at their non-political aspects of their life, because I think that's more interesting as a scientist. So today we got into many things. You won't believe it, but we got into Ben's beliefs or lack thereof about space travel and even on extraterrestrial intelligence. So you won't want to miss that or any other portion of this conversation. Trust me, I think you'll be glad you came along for the ride. And now sit back and enjoy this wide-ranging interview with none other than Ben Shapiro.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Welcome, everybody, to what will surely be one of my many great plunges in subscriber counts as I bring on very rarely political figures. But as I always say, astronomy, I got into it because there are no Republican constellations. There are no Democratic asteroids. And I like a politics-free zone. So actually today we're going to talk with my guest. Some say we look alike. We were separated at birth. I'm sorry to tell you that, Ben. We're talking with Ben Shapiro, proprietor, editor emeritus, the Daily Wire, proprietor of the Ben Shapiro Show. And Ben, how are you doing this fine season?
You know, I'm hanging in there, but I'm not in California like you, so better than you.
Well, you're welcome back anytime. Your money and your presence is welcome back anytime. So we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but I wanted to let you know this is our special Erev pre-Yom Kippur special. We did one last year at this time, and this one will be out on the eve of the holiest day of the year, which you told me last year is your favorite day on the calendar. Is that still true, Ben, that Yom Kippur is your favorite day on the calendar?
You know, it's one of those things where philosophically, yes, and then in practice, no. You know, I'm not a big fan of fasting. I do like food, but in theory, yeah. I mean, the idea that you get to have your sins relieved by God and that you get to face up to those and spend all day, dealing with existential questions is really kind of an amazing thing. So philosophically, yes. But about 11 o'clock in the morning when I haven't had anything to eat or drink and it's only been, 12 hours or 14 hours and now I've got another 10 hours to go. About that time, I start to have doubts.
That's right. I mean, if you like fasting that much, you can do it for me, or I can recommend a colonoscopy prep. That might be more.
Oh man, Som Gedalia, and then this one, it's like 2 and 3 weeks. It's good times.
Well, we're going to talk about Judaism because your latest book, which is your sixth in 1 year, is called The Authoritarian Moment, and I can judge. I'm holding it up to the camera now. I got an advance copy. Thank you very much to Emma and all your producers over there. But I also got the real copy. And the reason was I wanted to ask you and play a favorite game, the game that we're never supposed to do in life as authors, judge a book by its cover. So, Ben, rumor has it that the book is partially inspired by George Orwell, who we talked about last year. You remember we talked about Animal Farm and whether you'd trade your beautiful tail as Benjamin the donkey did for a shorter tail and not have to have the flies. Tell me, what is the inspiration for this title, this cover design? Where'd you come up with it? What's the backstory behind it?
And so the Authoritarian Moment, the title just came up because I was thinking about the title of The Authoritarian Mind by Theodore Adorno. Was probably the sort of basis for it. So there was an idea by Theodore Adorno, as a philosopher in mid-20th century, who argued that basically there was a certain mindset that tended toward the authoritarian. It turns out that his description of that mindset was not particularly accurate, but there were other sociologists who came around later who had sort of a slightly more accurate description of that. But it seemed to me that everybody these days is calling themselves authoritarian, and so I thought that it would be worthwhile examining sort of where the threats to freedom lie. And obviously, look, I'm a conservative, so I think there are certainly people on the right who are authoritarian, but the threats, as the subtitle suggests, are predominantly institutionally from the left at this point. So I'm not going to pretend that the book is a bipartisan examination into authoritarianism. It certainly is not. And the jackboot on the front is obviously supposed to be reminiscent of that sort of 1984 imagery, that there is the boot treading on the human face forever. And I think that a lot of people, actually, this is bipartisan. I think a lot of people in all facets of life at this point do feel as though there are other people who are coming for them because of their opinion. That's a really dangerous thing.
Yeah, it certainly is, and I always have this paradox when I read your books because they're intricately researched, they're decisively argued, and each one, the footnotes alone, could be a PhD thesis here at the University of California or elsewhere, and so it is extremely thoroughly researched, and yet I always have this dichotomy because I always want to ask the questions my audience would want to know. Besides, why are you having your younger, more attractive brother on? And that is, really to do with the fact that you and I share a religion. You are Orthodox, and Orthodoxy, as I take it, we are supposed to have a king. We are supposed to have a king in heaven. We're supposed to have an authority above us that we look up to, and maybe it's that there's only one. But how do you resolve this paradox that you submit willingly to the authority of God? And do so happily. I understand you serve God with joy, right? So how do you reconcile these two dichotomies? Why don't you serve, Gavin Newsom? Well, you're not here to serve Gavin Newsom, but why don't you serve, Donald Trump or Joe Biden with authority? Because look, this is the will, and we believe also that God. We pray for Joe Biden every week of the year, right? In synagogue. So anyway. How do you reconcile these two sides? The authority that you submit to and then the politicians that you refuse to submit?
So obviously, I think the divine authority predates any authority to man. And there is this belief even in the Bible, obviously, when it talks about Davidic kingship. Obviously, in the book of Deuteronomy, when it talks about you're going to have a king, it says you're going to regret having a king. And not only that, the king is supposed to write his own Torah scroll because he's supposed to be reminded of his moral obligations throughout the books of the prophets. The king is constantly being reprimanded by various prophets, right? David himself is reprimanded by Nathan. Saul is reprimanded by Samuel. There is this sort of check and balance system, even with regard to kingship, which is the most rudimentary form of top-down rule. There's this belief that the king is supposed to be subjected to certain higher moral standards. Now, the belief that you ought to be subject to a God in heaven also relies on your willingness to submit to a system of thought. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of, I'd say, differing strains even within Judaism as to who you listen to and why you listen to them. I tend to be much more Maimonidean in my approach. So Maimonides was very Aristotelian in his approach to religion. It was his belief that the commandments did have a rationale behind them that could be understood by human reason, even if we hadn't actually figured all of them out yet. And so there was a real natural law component to what Maimonides was talking about that really mirrors sort of the Thomistic view of Thomas Aquinas at the same time in the Christian world. And so it makes it a lot easier to say, listen, I agree with the authority of the Bible, but I also agree with the authority of the Bible because it tends to reflect the demands of the real world and reason interacting with those demands. And so, you don't have to, I think there's a vision of religion that religion is basically you throw out your individual human reason in favor of people telling you what to do. And the Maimonidean approach says that's not really the case, which is why religion and practice of religion, particularly in Judaism, was a common law sort of practice that has evolved pretty radically over time. I mean, there are famous sections of the Talmud where there's maybe the most famous section in all the Talmud. There's one section where there's a rabbi who goes up against a majority of his fellows in the study house on a particular issue. And he's obviously right. And he says he calls on heaven. He calls on the walls of the Beit Midrash, of the place that they're learning, to lean if he is right. He calls on the river to reverse itself if he's right. It does. He calls on a voice to come down from heaven if he's right. And all of these things happen. And then one of the other rabbis says, right, but none of those are authorities, right? We don't rely on the walls of the Beit Midrash to determine whether a right or a river or even a voice from heaven. It's left in our hands, right? Which is some of the verbiage in Deuteronomy as well, is that it's not in heaven, it's here for you. And so that means the interaction of the interaction of reason and revelation lies at the core of my faith. So if you get completely rid of reason, then I think you end up with theocracy. And if you get completely rid of revelation, I think that you end up at sort of a Nietzschean nihilism.
What do you say to those who, witnessing that tragedy and the man-made tragedy in Afghanistan say, well, it's great to speak about these as 8th century, barbarians and thugs. But wouldn't you like that? I mean, wouldn't you like not an authoritarian theocracy. But the rules of Judaism are pretty proscribed, as you say, as you talk about. Would you submit to, if we could somehow revivify, all the conditions needed to restore messianic times, et cetera, would you then submit to an authoritarian, to a government, not just to God, obviously, but to a basically semi-theocratic form of worship? Of course, you would believe it's benevolent, and as many would. Would you submit to that? I mean, is that something you would look forward to? Let me put it that way.
I think that to get into sort of the halachic details of what messianic kingship would look like is probably beyond the scope of what we're talking about. Suffice it to say that messianic kingship, even Davidic kingship, the amount of centralized authority that was actually brought to bear to actually enforce a lot of the laws that were on the books is pretty limited, which is why a lot of the punishments, even in the Bible itself, punishment is, for example, excommunication. Right? You're cut off. Right? Social refusal. Or you have a situation where it will say that your line is cut off, which is really between you and God. It really isn't between you and the compulsive government and what the government can compel you to do. There's sort of a lot of commentaries about what the government could allow you. But listen, I'm not a fan of kingship. I mean, I make this pretty clear. And by the way, I don't think Samuel was a fan of kingship. The notion that the only way this can be done is through a monarchy. There are a lot of forms of monarchy. Right? I mean, there's a British form of monarchy where the king doesn't have ultimate authority. And then there is the, theocratic monarchy where the king has all authority. So I think that these are, I'll rely on Rambam here. I'll rely on Maimonides, and I'll say that when the Messiah comes, I guess we'll discuss it. But my ideal form of government does not involve one person at the top of a government telling everybody else what to do without any check or balance. And I don't think the Torah does either, actually.
Right. Well, just to let you know, I get dibs on the Messiah after he's guest on your show, Ben. I had on recently Dr. Eric Topol, America's Doctor, I think, if it's not the First Lady. I wanted to ask you, he was, kind of very, very of two minds, that the government has a very strong place. And in fact, he advocated famously for, the withholding of the release of the Pfizer and other vaccine trials. But he's obviously, he said to me, he's not in favor of lying to the public to advance a good goal. In other words, have more mammograms. You shouldn't overstate the amount of cancer risk, for example. And yet I see you as a very early vaccine advocate. That was very clear. That was actually a very, very important, I think, moral lesson to many people that follow you. So how do you know? What's the rubric, speaking as a professor, what's the rubric? How do you know when to trust a governmental edict, a decree, and to submit to it? Because I think we have to submit to it at some level. I think Viktor Frankl said there should be a West Coast statue of responsibility, not just the statue of liberty. So how do you know? What's the rubric to know when a government edict is good or not?
I mean, they have to actually show you the evidence. And this is, I think, my problem with the public health bureaucracy throughout this pandemic is that Dr. Fauci's admitted that not only did he not show people the evidence that he was effectively lying to the American public repeatedly to achieve his goals. He did that on herd immunity, where he said, well, I thought that the American public was willing to withstand this level of herd immunity, so I said that percentage, then I shifted the percentage. He did it on masks early on, instead of saying that masking is effective, and then saying, but we need to make sure that our health providers have it first. Instead of doing that and asking for some shared sacrifice, he instead said that nobody needs a mask. He did it with regard to masking with regard to the vaccine. So post-vaccine, but before Delta, he was like, well, you definitely have to mask after you've had the vaccine. And then 2 weeks later, he shifted it. And we heard from public health officials who are not Fauci in the middle of the pandemic repeatedly that if you were out protesting against lockdown, this was very bad and spread the virus. But if you were out protesting George Floyd, this was very good and was necessary because racism was a public health crisis. And so when you have people saying that kind of stuff, I think it's very difficult to create the sort of institutional trust that's necessary to call upon. It just isn't there. There's a reservoir of trust that you need to call upon sometimes. And when the reservoir is empty, nobody's going to trust you. And I think that's so much of what has happened with the vaccines is that people who are not taking the vaccine, they have a real root base level of distrust in the public health bureaucracy and the media to tell them the truth, because the media have not told them the truth. And I think this is true even so far as, for example, risk factors and how exactly people differentiate based on age and health status. And they've done polls with the American public asking them, how likely do you think you are to die from COVID-19 broadly? And people are off by a factor of somewhere between 10 and 100. And if you ask people based on their age, they're off by way more than that. And so, that is really a problem, because what that also leads to is this reactionary feeling like, okay, well, if they say to do X, I'm going to do Y. It's, well, X might be right? So two things can be true at once. The public health bureaucracy sucks, And also the vaccines are extraordinarily effective and you should totally go get them, right? I mean, like these two things are you can hold them in your mind at the same exact time. And then when you're asked, why you would get the vaccine, I think it's fair to say, listen, I know what the IFR is for people in my age bracket. The IFR for people in my age bracket, the infection fatality rate, is higher, significantly higher than any fatality rate that's been established for the vaccines. The prospect of me getting, for example, myocarditis from the vaccine is significantly actually lower from the vaccine than it would be if I got COVID itself for my age bracket. The same may not hold true for kids under 12 because we really don't have any data about that. And one of the things that we do know about kids under 18 is that kids under 18 are not dying from this. So, but there are this comes up in the masking context too. I mean, there was an entire article in New York Magazine the other day about how there is literally no serious evidence that mask mandates with regard to children in school are effective. And then you hear constantly on the news that if you're anti-mask mandate, if you don't want to take your 5-year-old and put him in a mask and send him to school because, first of all, kids can't wear masks properly. They suck at it. I have 3 kids, 7 and 5, and then 1. And the 7 and 5-year-old, like they're constantly picking at the mask, taking it off, putting it in their pocket, spitting on it, eating, putting it back on, right? Like the cloth masks themselves are not nearly as effective as, for example, an N95. You're not going to make a kid wear an N95. And yet there's this perspective that's cropped up that if you don't want to mask your kid, it's because you want children to die. And it's just completely evidence-free. And so people are reacting to that by being like, well, screw all of this. Like, just screw all of it. I'm not going to listen to anything you guys have to say. And again, I think that that's the worst of all available worlds. But it's only the worst of all available worlds by a little bit, because I think the second worst of all available worlds is listen to everything they have to say. So they may even be equivalently dumb.
Right, that's the hard part again, and not to we're not doing a Havrusa Talmud study, but the point is to not go too far to the left or to the right, and they didn't mean politically, as they say back then. I don't think Moshe Rabbeinu was a Democrat or a Republican. And by the way, thank you for using one of your stock phrases. 2 things can be true at once. In my household, whenever Ben says that, we drink 2 cups of wine. So thank you for inebriating us so early in the morning. Merriam-Webster, the source of all scientific wisdom and knowledge, defines authoritarian as of or relating to favoring blind submission to authority, which means in some cases that there is an impulse. There's an impulse to be a follower, to be blindly led. And I wonder about that. Again, this notion that it's the hardest thing to really split the difference between knowing when to obey and knowing when to not obey. But I think there's secondary definition of or favoring concentration of power in a leader or an elite, not constitutionally responsible to the people. I think that's almost more appropriate for this book. This book, I agree with that. Yeah, is about all the different ways, the modalities in which our lives are governed. And yet, again, I always have to push back with respect to you, my friend Ben. I've, in the last year, have had on Michael Shermer. I've had on Dave Rubin. I've had on, let me see, on my list of past guests. Your friend, your boss, I think, Michael Knowles. I've had on Dennis. All these people have books out, and they're all about the suppression of free speech. And I wonder, how can we, how can we take you authors seriously, those that decry the awful suppression, the jackboots coming down? And when you guys are so successful and almost making the New York Times bestseller list in the case of Michael Knowles, how can we really take that seriously, that he is suppressed? Freedom of speech, he's left speechless. What do you have to say to critics that say, come on, you guys are overdoing it?
So my freedom of speech has absolutely not been suppressed. And let me make that clear from the very outset. My freedom of speech has not been suppressed. There have been sort of attempts informally to do that, right? It required 600 police officers at Berkeley for me to speak at Berkeley. Mm-hmm. But my free speech, listen, thank God, we have a very successful company. A lot of people listen to the show. The problem is actually for, I think, the person who's not in politics. I think, and I talk about this in the book, I think that there are a lot of people out there who are working for a corporation that is not political, ostensibly. And then they get a note from their boss on a particular political matter. And now they're expected to mirror the priorities of their boss. And if they don't, they're going to be fired, or they're going to be held in low esteem. Or you've got, the normal American who's not in the business of politics who posts something on Facebook and all of a sudden it blows up and their business is being boycotted. Or you have the normal person whose friends won't talk to them, family won't talk to them anymore because they voted for the wrong person. I mean, this sort of stuff is extremely common. As far as top-down refusal to allow my voice to get out there, let's put it this way. There are institutions that have attempted to censor, or there's been pressure inside institutions to censor even me, right? We saw earlier this year when I wrote the Politico playbook, and 200 staffers had a phone call with the heads of Politico complaining that I was allowed to even besmirch the sacred playbook. This actually resulted, ironically, in the formation of a nascent union at Politico. So I'm very eager to be seen as a union leader over at Politico. Frankly, I think that's exciting. I'm a labor leader now, and I'm fully happy to take credit for the unionization of Politico's workforce. Yeah. But it sort of differs institution by institution. This book is not primarily about governmental authoritarianism, though I think that's obviously a threat. It's much more about sort of informal social authoritarianism, and that I think we all do feel. And the argument that I've heard so often is that if it's not the government, it doesn't matter. And that's obviously untrue for the vast majority of Americans, for whom the institutions they deal with most on a daily basis are not the government, right? It's their company. It's the church they go to. It's the scientific experts they hear on TV. It's the sporting events that they consume, right? All of those institutions are cramming down a particular viewpoint. And if you refuse to acquiesce to the viewpoint, there are some pretty severe social consequences. Now, listen, there's a fine line between having an open and robust debate and the attempt to, for example, mobilize people against your political opponent's business and thus to destroy it. And I think that line is crossed pretty frequently these days.
What do you think about this reaction to the non-governmental, forces that are at work? I'm thinking in particular of the private spaceflight endeavors of, Bezos and Branson and Musk, and how they're almost villainized. And I'm looking at these people and I'm saying, NASA has a budget. I don't know if you know this, Ben, but NASA's budget is less than what people spend on lipstick every year. Now, you're a remarkably handsome man, being in my, compared to me, of course. But that lipstick budget's, $20 billion. And yet, if you ask the normal person, they spend billions, and half the GDP goes to NASA. No, they don't. They're just remarkably successful. And I wonder, what is this, reaction to the non-authoritarians? I don't even know if there's a name. I'm going to get into your neologism, ultra-crepidarianism. I can finally use that in Scrabble without embarrassment. What do you make of the hostility from Robert Reich, my fellow colleague at that fine institution up north, UC Berkeley? What do you make of this vilification almost of ways to save the government money? I mean, they've reduced the cost of private spaceflight and of commercial spaceflight by order of magnitude. Why are people so resistant to efforts to save the government money? I mean, shouldn't that...
Well, frankly, I don't think it has anything to do with saving the government money. I think they could spend their money on literally anything, and they would still be decried for their wealth unless they, sign a payout to a particular approved organization. What they're really angry at is that Jeff Bezos is rich. I mean, if Jeff Bezos were not rich, they wouldn't be angry at him. It has nothing to do with what he does with his own money. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I think that it's very cool, both that he is very wealthy and that he used that money to do something really awesome in developing new technologies that human beings haven't been able to develop before. That's a pretty amazing thing. Same thing with Elon Musk. Yep. I'm utterly confused why people are upset about this, except that I think there's a root jealousy that has been inculcated by a political elite that says that if somebody is worth, quote unquote, too much money, this means anything they do from here on out is bad. They were good people until they made a lot of money. Then they made a lot of money and they became bad. And I think this has infected, frankly, the whole society. I think that if you go back to the 1930s, there was a feeling about people who were wealthy, which is that I would also like to be one of them, which is why people, if you look at the lines, like the bread lines during the Great Depression, right? A horrifying time in American history economically. People on the bread lines were wearing suits. And they're wearing suits and hats and ties in the bread line. And now you have billionaires who are attempting to dress like homeless people. Because what you aspire to be today is a person who does not take stock of their wealth, right? If you're really cool with the people, then you can never show that you're wealthy. Listen, honestly, one of the things, there are many things I found not charming about Trump. One of the things that I found absolutely charming about Trump is that he was like, yeah, I'm rich, so. Yes, good. Really, we need more of that. Because I would like more people to be rich. I'd like more people to openly aspire to that. And it's funny, honestly, there are parts of American culture where this actually is not rejected, right? For example, rap culture really glorifies making a lot of money. I don't think that's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I think making a lot of money, if you're engaging in a bunch of consensual transactions with others, and then you are saying, I made a lot of money and I hope you do too, I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that that's a perfectly good thing. But there's this sort of embarrassment that American society now inculcates about success that is really antithetical to encouraging people to pursue that success. There's this notion that Jeff Bezos is, quote unquote, the privileged. if you look at Jeff Bezos' life story, that dude did not grow up privileged. Right? If you look at Steve Jobs' life story, these are people who did not grow up, in the heart of luxury. They made something of themselves. And yes, of course, they had people who helped them, because we all have people who help us along our way, no question. And we should all seek to help others along their way. But this kind of stark divide between how we call people who are wealthy the privileged versus the quote unquote underprivileged. It seems to me that we actually have to define what the privilege is before we determine whether somebody is privileged or underprivileged.
Right. And then the notion, it smacks against the notion of gratitude, or hakar satov, as we say. And I think that's dangerous, this notion that if we level, by the way, they never talk about how much LeBron James makes in a day. Or,
right.
It's always Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and Elon Musk. It's I don't know why, but for anyway, they're always this famous saying, who cares if it works in practice? Does it work in theory? That's the question we should have. Would you go to space, Ben, if they had glot tang?
I would go to space regardless of whether they had glot tang. I mean, the space is awesome. I've been trying to convince my wife that once it gets safe enough. Yeah. Where there's not a 1 in 10 chance of the thing blowing up. Then once that happens, I'm totally up for it. I mean, there are a couple of developments I'm really up for. I'm up for that. I'm really up for a lot of the talk about how this is going to lower travel time. I just think it'd be unbelievable to be able to fly from Florida to Australia and it'd take an hour and a half. That would be unbelievable. Yeah, and you'd get a good night's sleep when you're on the road. You'd lose a sponsor, though. I don't think your mattress company will support a zero gravity mattress. I want to ask a question about another. I'm going to read another definition from Merriam-Webster dictionary. It's ultra-crepidarianism. And the definition is, this word does not exist. Did you make this word up, Ben? Because I had never heard it before you, and I'm a master of the mot juste. What is ultra-crepidarianism, and am I guilty of it? I started to think I might be guilty of this malady. I mean, I think that all of us are guilty of it a little bit, but ultra-crepidarianism is the idea that you are speaking outside of your area of expertise. And I just thought there really ought to be a German term for it, but there really isn't. So we'll just have to use the English. Ultra-crepidarian is a word. I call it almost a philosophy, ultra-crepidarianism. But it's a phenomenon for sure. That and this I discussed in sort of the purview of science, is that you have this vast attempt in the field of science for people to speak out of areas that they actually know anything about. And you saw this largely in the public health debate, right, over the last year, where suddenly we moved from, what are disease vectors and how do they work and what are the epidemiological studies saying, to if you protest for George Floyd, you definitely won't get the virus. And it was and racism is a public health problem. I said, well, if you're defining racism as a public health problem, then we're not talking about public health anymore, right? We're not. You can talk about racism as a problem, but talking about it as a public health problem, broadly speaking, is now saying that everything is a public health problem, which I think is sort of the point. Once you start, it has a couple of effects. One is that you have a bunch of people talking about stuff they don't know about. And the second is that when you broaden your field out to include everything, people start seeing their own perspective as part of your field. Right? You'll start to see people saying unscientific things and then say those things in the name of science, even though they're not scientists. Right? The science says X, and X is just a political view that I happen to hold. Okay, well, maybe not. Maybe science doesn't say that. And also, when you cite a scientist, the scientist has to be talking about, you are in the sciences. I don't think that means that you are an excellent cook, right? Now, you could theoretically broaden out the possibilities of science to include, how the chemistry of cooking works. And you could probably talk about that all day long. But I'm not going to assume that you know how to cook an egg because you're a scientist. And yet, because science is the most valuable institution that we have in terms of just pure human prosperity, there is this willingness to grant a halo effect to science where we're like, okay, well, if a scientist said it and the dude's wearing a white coat, I guess I'll just do what he says now, even though it makes no sense at all. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, on those frame, I did a video called Follow the Science, which I argue just that you should not, for Prager University, that you shouldn't, this notion that because someone has a PhD in chemistry, and I pointed out, Fritz Haber, who is the father of fertilizer that powered our breakfast food this morning, he also invented chemical weapons, and he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry after World War I when these weapons were used, and he personally witnessed the devastation that they wrought. So listening to him on social policy or even warfare is a tragic mistake. And as I quote, in that video, Richard Feynman said, science is actually the belief in the ignorance of experts, not the wisdom of experts. The word science, as I pointed out to your friend Michael Knowles, it doesn't mean wisdom, it means knowledge. And wisdom is knowing not to, knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. But I wonder, as Galileo said, in the sciences, the authority of thousands of opinions is not worth as much as one spark of reason from an individual man. And I wonder, the book about authoritarianism, when we look to science, is there a danger in kind of venerating science too much, in the sense that scientists have all the traits? I always say scientists are like children. They're curious, they're whimsical, they're intellectual, they just want to know everything. They're passionate, they don't play well with others, they don't share their toys, they're jealous, they're petty. We have a lot of negative traits in science. Doesn't mean don't listen to science. I'm not antagonistic. Obviously, I've devoted my life to it. But what is there not a danger? We do have authority bias. We have prestige bias. We have confirmation bias. We have all these biases in not the science, TM, Ben Shapiro, 2021, but in science itself. We have all these biases, prejudices, lacunae in our character. Why should we venerate science so much?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is why, venerating science as a process that is capable of producing useful results to people is totally worthwhile. But even that, has its limits, meaning that I feel like people do the same thing with economics. They'll say, well, economics doesn't fill the needs of the human soul. And I keep thinking to myself, right, did it ever say it was going to? Like, well, why would it? And it's the same thing with science, except that a lot of scientists think that science is supposed to fill the need in the human soul, right? This is my kind of long-running debate with Sam Harris. I don't think that you can get from is to ought. I don't think that you can look at the scientific facts of existence and then immediately go from there to a cohesive moral framework that wasn't actually kind of rooted in just Judeo-Christian morals that you're now guising as humanism. So it's, I think that there's a real mistake that is made by folks in science to declare that everything is science, and also by people who are not scientific to simply grant credibility to that, because once you slap the label science on something, we're all supposed to believe it. And there's also this bizarre and stupid reductionism where people will give very complex results, but then they think that the public can't handle the results, and so they reduce it down to some sort of headline that actually isn't true. Right. You see this all the time in science. You saw it with COVID a lot. But you certainly see it with global warming as well, right? Where people will say global warming is a threat to how we live over the course of the next century. That's a very broad statement. Then you get into the specifics and you look at it and you say, okay, well, it's probably going to lead to, for example, more intense hurricanes, but it doesn't necessarily have an impact on frequency of hurricanes. And it's unclear if the damage done by hurricanes is actually due to the increased winds of the hurricane or the fact that the target has now increased because people are building more on these coasts, right? And when you look at the impact of global warming over the course of time, the IPCC itself has a rather broad range of how much the temperature could change over the course of the next century. It's like anywhere from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 4.5 degrees Celsius, which is a huge range. And when you point out all of this, or when you point out that certain solutions that are undertaken in the name of science are very unlikely to have any sort of serious effect on the climate, say the Kyoto Protocols or the Paris Peace Accords, when you point that out, then people say you're anti-science. And it's like, well, no, I'm using the exact same sources you are. I'm just making a different political argument. But this is now considered anti-science on the basis of what exactly? And that's a dangerous thing, because then again, we are getting to the point very quickly where when institutions are misused, people lose trust in the institution. If you lose trust in science as a value, then that's going to have some really dire downstream effects. Frankly, I think that you're seeing it for a lot of folks who refuse to take the vaccine, not for any scientific reason, but just because they just don't trust the institutions promulgating the sort of science talk that isn't really scientifically rooted.
Right. You see that a lot. I joke in my book, every 4 years we find out from 70 Nobel Prize winners, which Democrat we should vote for. And, it becomes, what is someone who studies low temperature superconductivity or string theory, what do they have to teach us about, who should be the leader of the free world, the most powerful country in human history. I want to talk about big tech now. Obviously, you're a huge fan of technology. You can eat like a king nowadays. You can live better than a king. You can get a chauffeur to come to your house with a push of a button. You can get a home cooked meal, from your favorite, place down the street delivered to you from your mother, or you can get a restaurant cooked meal if you're so inclined. You can get medical diagnoses. I believe you met your wife on Tinder. These are all social media and other tools to communicate. You have more reach than almost anybody on earth. I had Neil deGrasse Tyson on my show a couple months back, and I said, Neil, you're the most famous scientist in human history because 40 million people know who you are right now, and you can it's not like you're you've passed away. And he's like, no, but the influence that technology confers, is this double-edged sword, as the Bible says? Is this worth it? Is this tool? Because it seems to me, Twitter is the most efficient tool ever devised for spreading lashon hara, evil speech. How do we balance the technology authority that is inherent in all these apps, because we love it, we need this technology, and we live better because of it? How do you balance those two competing demands?
For sure, and I think that that's particularly true with a lot of these services that are really designed to be kind of addictive. I mean, the fact is that when they designed Twitter, for example, that little kind of thwip that you hear every time you refresh is designed to be almost a Pavlovian response for you, that you get like a little dopamine hit every time you do that.
Yeah.
And that's why you find yourself doing it all the time. And so for me, I just took Twitter directly off my phone, right? If I want to be on Twitter, I'm going to have to be on my computer and sit and think about what I'm typing, as opposed to just being on my phone and just randomly throwing things out there, which has been, I think, beneficial for my life. And the answer to this is like the answer to, all other problems of technological systems that both make our lives better, but also provide for the possibility of greater sin. And that is, you really have to create prophylactic rules for yourself in their use. And this has been true about literally every technology ever developed, right? Or pretty much all of them. That if you are like the car made possible the ability to have an affair in another city, right? Like if you're horsebound, basically the group of people that you could go out with and sleep with was limited to the distance that you could take your horse within a couple of hours.
Yeah,
that wasn't all that far.
Genghis Khan, it really was bad for him. The horse,
right? Well, he had unique success in this respect, but the car and the plane, right? All of these things enable sin in ways that the horse does not. Does that mean that the car and the plane are bad? No, of course, the car and the plane are wonderful, wonderful creations. What it does mean is that as a species, we have tended to confuse, this goes back to your last question a little bit, we have tended to confuse technological and scientific development with moral development, and they are not the same thing whatsoever. And in fact, as technology gets more sophisticated, there is a significant call on the human capacity to be more moral. And we have largely shirked the call. We have insane levels, while we talk about the level of privacy that's not available online, and you should all get ExpressVPN for this, the reality is that you can now partake in all sorts of sin from the privacy of your own home that you would have to go out into public to do before. And so this has enabled sin on record levels. So this means that you actually have to be prophylactic in your own acknowledgement of your own sinful capacity. And yet we also live in a society that says that to even mention the capacity for sin is to be shaming people. You don't want to sin shame somebody. You don't want to make somebody feel bad about themselves. And so, with greater technology comes a greater need for us to be reflective about how we act. And that's difficult. I mean, nobody likes being reflective. It's no fun. Except for me on Yom Kippur. That's
That's right. Your fasting, your Yom Kippur app has saved many. It actually allowed me to drop 5 pounds from my double chin to my backside. I want to ask now about another thing near and dear to my heart, and I know to your heart too. In all seriousness, academia. You're a scholar. You clearly, thoroughly love the life of the mind. And on one hand, academia hasn't really changed much in 1,000 years since the first university in Bologna, Italy, in 1080. You have some guy scratching on a piece of rock with another piece of rock, and we call that learning. And almost nothing has changed in that millennium since. I wonder, is there something in store? You've got this media corporation now. You've got you're now doing entertainment. You've obviously been doing news. I wonder if by the way, is Daily Wire planning like a national The Science Foundation with academia? Do you see it ripe for disruption? Do you see this? As you talk about in the book, you talk about the Varsity Blues scandal. We had these actresses and actors getting their daughters into college that didn't want to go to college and didn't even need to take the SAT for the college. They wanted to go to Juilliard. One of them, she didn't even need to go take the SATs, let alone be coached illicitly in doing so. So anyway, what do you see as the opportunities for disruption in academia, which you spend not an inconsiderable amount of time in the book devoting to?
So this is one place where I think the internet's really going to help. So first of all, you see a tremendous appetite for people who do want to learn online, right? I mean, you have things like the Great Courses Plus or Hillsdale online programs, and people, or PragerU for that matter, people who are looking for information on a regular basis and want it. And I think that as more and more colleges move online, I think the pandemic helped accelerate this. I think that you're going to see alternatives start to form that are a hell of a lot cheaper than hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. In order to effectuate that, you're going to need businesses to stop looking at the Ivy League credential as though it is the be-all, end-all. And this is coming from somebody who went to an Ivy League law school. I don't actually think that it's necessary for somebody to even go to college in order to be an excellent employee. And I think there will come a point where smart first movers in the space are going to start seeking good employees in places outside sort of the traditional well-trod paths, right? There's going to be somebody who instead decided to get their degree in something in a year and a half in an online program by a Harvard Extension or something. Mm-hmm. And then people look at that and go, well, that's good enough for me. They also got a 1,500 on their SAT, so I know they're smart. And I think that colleges, unless you're in the actual hard sciences, I think that colleges have largely become a sorting mechanism. And the sorting mechanism is a very expensive sorting mechanism that puts people severely into debt. But I don't think that just because you got a poli-sci degree from UCLA the way that I did, I don't think that means that you're necessarily going to be a better employee than a person who got the same score I did on the SAT, graduated at the same age, and didn't get a poli-sci degree from UCLA.
I wonder, though, I mean, I'm actually working on a project to take the written word of Galileo for the first time and make it into an artificial intelligent learning engine because there's never been something like that. And why learn, celestial mechanics from me when you can learn it from Isaac Newton or Galileo, as good as I think I am at teaching it. But then it opens up to me this concern that, with machine learning and artificial intelligence, do you see, kind of a very brief calm before that storm when now it's going to be, if you thought it was at scale before the spying, the authoritarianism, once we get, supercomputers, quantum computers in charge of the algorithms, are we just toast?
I mean, we may very well be. But I think that as I was saying, with all technology comes, we have to have a lot of humility when we approach these technologies and recognize that we're going to have to set limits on ourselves because, when it comes to the vagaries of machine learning, you know better than I do. So I'm not, I tend to be sort of a technological optimist as opposed to, somebody who believes that Skynet is coming and it's going to kill all of us and that the machines are going to wake up and decide that we're their overlords and it's time to kill everyone. If that happens, then I guess I'll, just be among the ruins and won't have much to say about it. But as long as that doesn't happen, then the increased capacity seems to me to open a lot of vistas for people. But, there are consummate downsides, obviously, in how this stuff is used. So we're going to need a lot better controls, governmental or otherwise, although I don't trust the government to control itself in these areas.
Right. And building on that and technology as a whole, I think I was able to connect you with Michael Saylor, who's one of the biggest Bitcoin proponents on the face of the planet. And I was glad to make that connection. But I want to talk about disruption there because we saw recently, and my condolences, Ben, that they took down your favorite site, OnlyFans. Where you have, one of the most popular accounts in Yiddishkeit.
It's just me wearing tuxedos. That's all it is. Yeah.
It's you and stylized Kippa Sur Gaz. And that's the only way you can get it is join Ben's OnlyFans account. But anyway, they took it down, right? And there was credit cards. And we had Amazon Web Services take down, Parler and so forth. Do you see opportunities? I don't know if you got into this with Michael Saylor, but I know many of my audience is very curious about what can things like the decentralization of technology, the de-authoritarianism of both blockchain and Bitcoin as a means of transaction that's immune from government, snooping in some level. I'm not going to get into the details, but also for things like academia and even communication, peer-to-peer, not relying on, Twitter could turn off your account tomorrow, as we know, right? So what do you see? Are you optimistic about that? Are there any potentials that you're most interested in that space as in technology?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super pumped up about that. So the decentralization of money, via Bitcoin, the effectuation of that technology in other spheres, decentralization of informational dissemination, right, which has sort of been done, but on the old mechanisms, just like money used to be done on the old mechanisms, right? That's what PayPal was. Instead, the sort of next generation stuff where it will be completely peer-to-peer and you won't need an intermediary to do any of that. Everything will just sort of live in the ether and be verified not by a centralized company saying that you are you, but by a blockchain technology, for example. Like that stuff's going to be really cool. And it's also going to allow for a lot to thrive. Now, that also is going to mean that bad guys thrive. But, that is just the risk of liberty is that bad people do bad things. And that's a risk that I'm willing to take. I think that the attempt over and over and over again, for example, to cast the bad people out from Facebook has not resulted in the bad people not being online. It's resulted in them being at 4chan and then 8chan and then presumably 16chan. And they'll just keep channing it up. And at a certain point, they go underground and they go to places where, and the government follows them. And all of that, maybe that's effective, maybe that's not. But it seems to me that the greater risk to me is a centralized authority telling you what you can and cannot say online, for example, or what financial transactions you can and cannot pursue. Right? If credit card companies, I think in the near future, might be in the position where they just start banning particular credit card users because they don't like who they are. There was a report over the weekend that maybe one of the credit card companies was doing that to Michael Flynn. That scares the living hell out of me. Like, these are neutral service providers. And so the potential to, just have a Bitcoin wallet, for example, where it's not up to Bitcoin, it's not up to Coinbase to decide if you can and cannot have a wallet. And I mean, frankly, they can't. They don't even have the capacity to determine, whose wallet it is, really. Because, theoretically, if you've got, Bitcoin in the name of a code, then the code owns the wallet. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, then it removes a lot of these obstacles. I'm very much in favor of, I've been thinking a lot about this since I got kind of into Bitcoin over the last couple of months, 3 months. Mm-hmm. And I'm very into the idea of radical decentralization at this point, because we've seen radical centralization in corporate life. We've seen radical centralization in informational dissemination. We've seen radical dissemination in terms of money supply. And so if we can reverse a lot of those trends, I think that'd be an excellent thing.
And in terms of the, the media outreach, et cetera, I do think that there's incredible opportunities for this technology. And even in science, I think you could do things where you could, somebody has some discovery or some, vaccine, but they're not ready for it to be released. They could stake it on the blockchain, show proof of work, and this could be something that could transform science as well. I think we're definitely in the early days there. And I'm excited to see what happens there. Speaking of, going into the realm of media that you are so expert in, there's a famous Yiddish saying, I'm sure you've heard it. He who stands in the middle of the road gets hit by both sides of the traffic. In other words, the fact that you are so courageous, some say brazen. Do you take more risks now, would you say, Ben, as your celebrity increases, the network effect, you have this wide-ranging influence now that you probably couldn't have dreamed of just 10 years ago when I first started following you. Do you think that there's a limit, or that there's some restraint on who you are that will allows you to take risks that maybe some of the readers couldn't? If one of my students writes me and says, I can't say this to my professor in class, but maybe I can say it to you. I get messages like that all the time. He or she could get repercussions. And yet you make your living on having an opinion and being paid to do so quite handsomely, as we know from ExpressVPN. But I want to know, have you become more bold, or have you decided to just take more chances now, or are you still the same old Ben, that I listened to on what was it, Truth Revolt a decade ago?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some of both. So on the one hand, I'm more prominent. That means I can withstand more risk. So that's great. It means I can say things that, I can get away with things that maybe other people can't. Like if I have strong feelings about vaccines, I'm going to say what the strong feelings about vaccines are. And if it ticks people off, then, so be it. I try to couch everything I say in terms of data. So if people want to get mad at the data I'm using, that's okay. But I've always tried to approach things from a data-driven point of view, except when maybe I was 17 or 18 and you're just, attention seeking. Which is what people do when they're teenagers. Unfortunately, when you're 17 or 18 and writing a public column, the attention seeking is on your permanent record. So in any case, it's not quite, now, obviously, I'm able to say things that I think many other people aren't able to say on politics, and that works in both directions. Although for a lot of people, I'd say it's mostly from the right. The counterintuitive effect is that if you are, very prominent, and if you speak to a lot of people, this means that if you make a mistake, everybody notices. Right. And so this means that you have to be very, very careful in how you approach this stuff. And that's the stuff of nightmares, right? I literally will have nightmares where I get on the air and I say something that's just totally untrue. And I'll wake up in a cold sweat, like, oh God, I hope I didn't say that. And it's, and that I try to be extremely careful about what I say on air, at least factually speaking. Mm-hmm. When it comes to opinion, you get impassioned, you say things, you fly off the cuff, that sort of stuff happens. But you really do have to be careful in the sort of information you disseminate, and even in your approach, right? There's certain sort of there is an Overton window. I think the Overton window right now in American life is far too narrow, but it does exist. And seeking to say the right thing while not triggering, for example, the overlords at YouTube to take you down is always sort of an interesting balance that you have to draw, because people might say that that's self-interested. Well, if nobody can actually hear my show, it's not just self-interested, it's listener interested. Right. My listeners still want to hear the show. Mm-hmm.
And along those lines, and because it's the eve of Yom Kippur, I want to ask you about, we talked about sin and sinning at scale with the rise of technology. What about teshuvah? What about repentance? What about atonement? Are there opportunity? Can we atone for anything? I mean, is there room, not just in the Overton window, which I think of as, is kind of remote from most of my listeners, but, they're not on CNN or in the New York Times, who published one of your obituary eulogizing Rush Limbaugh. I mean, I thought that was a very good, positive sign. But anyway, is there room for teshuva or repentance, or is it cast in the amber of the blockchain of cancellation and recrimination?
So I think it depends from whom. So there's a certain group of people whose sole goal in life is just to extirpate you from public life. And for those people, there's no repentance. But I think for most other people, there really is. And I think Americans generally want to give people second chances and allow them back through the door. I think that there's been an attempt right now to basically say that whatever sins you have committed are on your permanent record. You can never come back from that. And I'm actively trying to fight back against that, right? I mean, I think that if you said something that was bad and now you've repented and now you want to come back to public life, I think that we should try to make some pretty significant efforts to allow that to happen, because we ought to incentivize teshuva. I've done some of that stuff publicly myself, right? I mean, I'm the only columnist I know of, I think, ever, who has put up an entire list of the things I think I've said over the course of the last 20 years that I think are wrong or bad, and then try to explain what I was trying to say or what I failed to say or whether I was just being an idiot, right?
You gave Media Matters a kill list. That was actually...
Yeah. I mean, that's what it was. I mean, I effectively went back through and I was like, okay, here's all the stuff that I've said over the last 20 years. Here's a really bad tweet. Here's what I meant by it. It didn't come out that way and it's bad. Right? And I think that that's a useful thing. I think we should all, do that from time to time. There have been times when I've done this interpersonally. I remember that, way back when I was a kid, maybe 17, 18 years old, I tweeted something that wasn't particularly nice about Rabbi David Wolpe in Los Angeles. And Barry Weiss, who I was friends with, she said, you don't know Rabbi Wolpe and you really should meet with him. And I called him up and we got together and he expressed to me how upset he'd been by that tweet. And I was like, yeah, that was, at that point, 15 years ago. And I didn't realize that, that I was young and stupid and I'm sorry about that. And he said, right, but it's one thing for you to apologize to me in person. And, that tweet is still out there. And so I went on Twitter and I put out a tweet saying, sometimes you just get people wrong and you get things wrong. And I apologize for this. That was wrong. It was 10, 15 years later. So I think that, apologizing at scale is very often effective. And you, as Donald Trump says, you try to be in a position where you don't have to apologize. But if you do, then it does give you the opportunity to do so in pretty large measure.
And every Donald Trump or John Kerry impersonation by Ben earns somebody a glass of whiskey in my house. Thank you, Ben, for that. There is the famous mushal story of a man who disparages his rabbi and then goes and asks for repentance and forgiveness. And the rabbi says, yeah, bring a pillow. And the guy says, all right, I'll bring a feather pillow. What's it for? His rabbi says, cut it open. Let the wind scatter the feathers to the four winds. And the guy says, oh, thank you, Rabbi, for forgiving me. He said, no, you're not forgiven yet. Now go out and collect all the feathers. And I think that's really true. It is harder to, put the toothpaste back in the tube, as they say, than to squeeze it out in the first place. A lightning round has come upon us, Ben. I know you only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to play the lightning round of Into the Impossible, as we are wont to do on this podcast. Reminder, we're speaking to Ben Shapiro, proprietor of the Ben Shapiro Show, the Sunday Special, which I've been honored to be a part of. And I know I apologize in advance to all the many OnlyFans that I'm going to lose. But you know what? I love talking to Ben. I learn something every time I talk. Every time you write a book, I'm glad I can see your hands. So I know you're not actually writing your 18th book in 3 years. But I look forward to all your future work. Is there anyone that you wouldn't talk to on the show? I mean, not just like a Farrakhan or somebody like a repugnant, invidious, human being, but is there anyone you wouldn't talk to that's kind of in the public sphere? Or conversely, is there someone you're dying to talk to, and you just can't get for one reason or another?
So, I mean, there's some people who I've tried to get on the program who I think would be really interesting to talk to. I think it'd be interesting to talk to George W. Bush. We haven't had that opportunity yet. There's some, kind of more obscure professors who wouldn't be obscure in their fields, but are obscure to kind of the general public, who I think would be fun to talk to sort of, and you have to sort of monetize it and figure out how that works, right? Because a fun conversation doesn't always mean that it pays for itself in terms of crew time or anything. So that's probably, as far as people who I wouldn't talk to, outside of the Farrakhan crowd and people who I like, because you're talking publicly, one of the things that you do have to determine is whether you believe that the view is so vile that airing the view itself is doing a disservice, because no matter how well you rebut the position, you've now granted the position added credibility. And I don't believe that there's no such thing as the Overton window. I make a pretty strong distinction between the presence of an Overton window, which I agree with, and the limits of the Overton window, which I think right now are far too narrow. But yeah, I mean, there are people who I think it's worthless to talk to, where I'd be radically raising somebody's profile to no purpose other than to radically raise the profile of a terrible person, or a person who I think has terrible beliefs. And obviously, like, I wouldn't have on the spokesperson for the Taliban to give their point of view on women's rights. Like, you
can just go to their Twitter account.
That's true. You can go to their Twitter account. So there's some of that. And then there are some people who, I just don't think are up for a real conversation and who are just there to score points. And, while there might be an organized debate setting where that might be useful, right? Where you say, okay, well, this is going to be, rock'em sock'em robots. We know the rules going in. But what you don't like and what I don't like is you organize a conversation and then the person comes in treating it like a boxing match. And it's like, well, that's not right. Yeah. And so you sort of have to set the preconditions on the ground for what the conversation is going to look like. And then if somebody breaks the rules, then you have to smack them. Yeah.
I believe debate is basically pointless. You never convince, that was a great Biden-Trump debate. That really changed my mind. How do you know when you're doing a good interview? How do you know when an interview is going well? What's the algorithm in the back of your mind in real-time feedback to know that you're doing a good job or not?
I mean, usually it kind of comes out in level of engagement. So a bad interview is one where I'm getting tired or bored. And so my speed of speaking or thinking starts to slow down. I start to get distracted. I have to re-ask the interviewer what the question was, that sort of stuff. As far as sort of an adversarial interview, if I take on, I've realized that the more passionate I am about topics, sometimes the worse I am at them. A certain level of reserve is necessary. In the same way that, a doctor wouldn't want to operate on a relative. I don't ask my wife to operate on our kids, God forbid. If you're too invested in something, you tend to lose the necessary objectivity to having a productive conversation. And so when you get to a certain level of remove, that's actually sometimes quite good for a conversation, especially if the discussion is adversarial. If you're too invested, you can get over the top. And I've had conversations like that publicly that I regret and think sucked.
Yeah. Last question in the zeitgeist, literally, are these notions of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. You haven't had any real discussion of that on your show. I'm wondering, why do you think it's so much in the zeitgeist, in the spirit of the times? And what do we make of its importance and threat perhaps to this country? Do you think that aliens exist? Do you think they're among us? Do you think that there's reason to be suspicious? Where do you come down on that spectrum?
So I think aliens may exist. I do not think they are among us, unless we're talking about like animal species, because those are weird. And do I think that they are like, foreign objects from China or something? I don't think they have that sort of tech capacity at this point. If they do, I think that we'll be the first to know. So I'm really, really skeptical of all the UFO talk. Especially, have you ever seen one of my favorite things is the map of UFO sightings? So if you look at the map of UFO sightings, basically the entire United States is lit up, and then the rest of the world, there's nothing.
Right. It's
like, why is that? It's either because the aliens are specifically and only interested in the American way of life, and like The Simpsons, or because Americans are uniquely susceptible to looking up in the sky, seeing things with lights on, and being like, I don't recognize that thing with the light on. I'm going to take a picture of it, and I'm going to tell people that it was a UFO. So I don't know. I'm really, really skeptical of its alien intelligences, and they're hanging out, but they're also not doing anything. And they have to monitor us using physical objects as opposed to, surveillance craft from space or anything like that. I count myself among the wild skeptics of this stuff.
Yeah. And hopefully, if they do decide to serve you, they'll at least fatten you up with some good kosher meal beforehand. Ben Shapiro, longtime listener, second time host of you on the Into the Impossible podcast. I want to thank you. I want to wish you an easy fast. I want to wish you New Year's blessings to you and your family of health and success. And I just want to keep giving you the hope that you will continue in this courageous stance that you take in society. I think you are an extremely important figure in the culture and in our world. So thank you, Ben, for being my guest.
No, thanks so much. Gemar Chasima Tova.
Gemar Chasima Tova. Bye, Ben.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
If you hated this video, I know you'll love this interview with Ben's former Harvard Law professor, Larry Tribe. And if you did enjoy this video, please check out my past interview with Ben Shapiro here. And don't forget to subscribe.